I was raised like most people, taught that taxation is simply the price of civilization. Roads, courts, armies, the social contract. You pay your share. That is the deal. That has always been the deal. Except it hasn't. The deeper I looked, the more that certainty, that bedrock assumption, began to crack. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. The way a reflection shatters when a stone breaks the surface of still water. Here is what started everything. A single sentence, buried in a footnote of a 1911 congressional debate transcript, found in a university archive, digitized almost as an afterthought. 43 words that changed how I see everything. The American citizen has never in the history of this republic been compelled to surrender a portion of his labor directly to the federal government. Sit with that. Not a fringe pamphlet, not a conspiracy document, a congressional record, officially entered into the legislative history of the United States of America. And then 2 years later, everything changed. The 16th Amendment was ratified in February 1913. By October of that same year, Americans filed their first federal income tax returns. Not hundreds of years of taxation, not gradual evolving policy. A single year, a single amendment, a single pivot point in history, after which the entire relationship between a citizen and their government transformed permanently. And here is the strangest part. Nobody seemed to ask why. Let me take you back, not to 1913. Further, to the world your great-great-grandparents actually inhabited. For most of recorded American history, from the founding through the early 20th century, the federal government operated primarily on tariffs, import duties, excise taxes on specific goods, alcohol, tobacco, sometimes luxury items. These were taxes on transactions, on commerce, not on the labor of individual citizens, not on what you earned, not on the hours you spent building your life. The distinction matters far more than it sounds. A tariff touches you when you choose to buy something from abroad. An excise tax touches you when you choose to purchase a taxed good. But an income tax touches you simply for existing as a productive human being. It reaches into the transaction between you and your employer, between you and your land, your craft, your skill. And it says, before you can call this yours, we take a portion. That had never happened before. Not at the federal level, not in peacetime. There was a brief income tax during the Civil War, brief, repealed in 1872. Then the Supreme Court struck down another attempt in 1895, ruling it unconstitutional in Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company. The legal reasoning was unambiguous. A direct tax on income, unapportioned among the states, violated the Constitution. The official story of how we moved from that ruling to a ratified constitutional amendment in under 2 decades is presented as simple democratic evolution. The progressives wanted it, the people supported it. It passed. End of story. But the official story collapses under examination. Because when you study who actually supported the 16th Amendment, when you look not at the rhetoric but at the funding, the lobbying, the back-channel communications now preserved in historical archives, the picture becomes devastatingly more complicated. Ask yourself a straightforward question. Who benefits when the government gains a permanent, elastic, infinitely expandable claim on individual income? Not the farmer in Ohio, not the craftsman in Pennsylvania, not the miner in Colorado. When you trace the institutional support for the income tax amendment through the congressional record, a haunting pattern emerges. The most vocal advocates were not the poor, for whom the tax was supposedly designed as a tool of redistribution. They were the architects of large financial institutions. Men who understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that a government empowered to tax income is also a government empowered to borrow against future tax revenue, to grow, to spend, to expand its financial obligations without limit. And in that same year, 1913, something else happened. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law in December. the same year, the same calendar year, two transformative pieces of financial legislation, one giving the government unlimited access to citizen income, the other creating a centralized banking system designed to manage the government's debt. Not coincidence, not bureaucratic timing, not accidental overlap, a coordinated architecture. What kind of federal government requires both simultaneously? What expansion of scope and ambition demands that a state simultaneously gain the power to tax individual income and construct a central bank to manage its debt in the same 12 months? That is not fiscal policy. That is infrastructure, built for something larger than what had existed before. Consider the speed. In 1912, there is no federal income tax enforcement apparatus, no auditors, no investigators carrying federal criminal authority, no agency empowered to seize your wages, your bank accounts, your property. None of it exists, because none of it is needed. The infrastructure matches the law. Zero tax, zero enforcement machine. By 1919, 6 years later, the Bureau of Internal Revenue employs thousands. It has regional offices in cities across the country, an intelligence division, a special agents unit with prosecutorial referral authority, physical buildings, purpose-built or commandeered, operating in coordinated networks from Boston to San Francisco. 6 years, not decades of gradual institutional evolution, not slow bureaucratic accumulation, not the organic, stumbling growth of a government agency finding its footing. 6 years from nothing to a nationally coordinated enforcement empire, investigators, auditors, criminal referral authority, and the architectural footprint to house all of it simultaneously across the entire country. The deeper I went into the physical record, the actual buildings, the early internal memoranda, the staffing documents now accessible through the National Archives, the more the timeline became impossible to explain by chance. Field offices appeared in cities with no particular tax base that would justify their scale. Training manuals for special agents were printed and distributed before the ink on enabling legislation had fully dried. The apparatus preceded the need, or matched it with a precision that suggests the need was anticipated far earlier than the public record acknowledges. The official explanation is wartime expansion, progressive era institutional confidence, the natural machinery of a modernizing state. But institutional architecture does not materialize fully formed. It gets designed. It gets planned. Someone drew the organizational chart before the amendment was ratified. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The enforcement machine was not built to serve the tax. The tax was the justification for building the machine. I spent weeks in archive rooms, the smell of aged paper, the terrifying fragility of documents that were never meant to survive this long, the handwritten margin notes of men who believed they were writing for themselves and not for history. What I found was not a single smoking gun. It never is. It is always a pattern, always an accumulation. The congressional debates leading up to the 16th Amendment are remarkable for what they refuse to discuss. Almost no extended debate about what happens after ratification. Almost no projection of where rates might go. Almost no serious examination of enforcement mechanisms, of penalties, of what willful failure to file might mean in practice. Why? Because in 1913, the top marginal rate was 7%. On incomes over $500, $0. The vast majority of Americans paid nothing at all. The tax, as initially presented, was almost symbolic, a gesture, a precedent. Not a permanent restructuring of the relationship between citizen and state, just a small, reasonable measure, nothing to be alarmed about. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The same architecture appears again and again throughout history. A new power is introduced at its most modest, least threatening scale, a small tax, a temporary measure, an emergency provision, and then, gradually, then suddenly, it expands to fill whatever space is available. By 1944, the top marginal income tax rate in the United States was 94%. 94%. The initial rates were never the point. The mechanism was the point, the precedent, the constitutional permission. The crime was not what they took in 1913. The crime was what they made possible. Here is where it becomes something I cannot stop thinking about. There is an entire world of pre-1913 American economic life that has not been erased exactly, but has been allowed to fade quietly from living memory. Let me describe it for you. Your great-grandparents, assuming they were working-class or middle-class Americans in the late 19th century, kept everything they earned, minus whatever they chose to spend on taxed goods. A skilled tradesman in 1890 negotiated his wage with an employer, received that wage, and it was his. Entirely. No withholding, no filing, no April deadline, no federal hand waiting at the threshold. Homesteaders worked land they could claim under the Homestead Act, 160 acres essentially free in exchange for improving it. The transaction between a man and his land produced no federal liability. None. Small merchants, craftsmen, farmers, the entire economic ecosystem of pre-industrial and early industrial America operated in a fundamentally different relationship to government. Local taxes existed, property taxes, state levies, but the direct federal claim on individual productive labor was absent by design, by constitutional prohibition. That world is gone. And the deeper I went, the more I noticed the silence surrounding that fact. It doesn't appear prominently in economics textbooks. It is not framed as a loss in the standard history curriculum. The pre-1913 world is simply presented as primitive, underfunded, unstable, as if the income tax were medicine for a dying patient rather than a transformation of a healthy one. No honest reckoning, no real comparison, no acknowledgement of what was surrendered. Just silence. Smooth. Institutional. Carefully maintained silence. The silence was deafening, and then they made it a crime. That phrase deserves to be held. Before 1913, there was no such thing as failure to file. There was no federal crime called tax evasion at the personal income level because there was no personal income tax to evade. The category of criminality simply did not exist. You could not be prosecuted for something that carried no legal requirement. After 1913, a new class of criminal was invented. Not someone who had physically harmed another person. Not someone who had defrauded a specific identifiable victim. Someone who had simply failed to accurately report and surrender a portion of their own labor to a centralized authority. This is not a trivial observation. Criminality defines the boundaries of a civilization. What a society chooses to prosecute tells you everything about what that society is actually protecting. And the criminalization didn't arrive all at once. It crept. The Revenue Acts of the 1910s and 1920s quietly expanded penalties. The tax code thickened, and withholding, the automatic deduction of wages before the worker ever touches the money, wasn't introduced until 1943. Before that, you still paid annually. You still saw the money first. Withholding changed something psychological, something fundamental. Once the money was removed before you ever received your paycheck, you stopped experiencing it as yours being taken. You began accepting your net pay as your pay. The gross amount became abstract, theoretical, a number printed on a form rather than weight in your hand. Not subtraction, redefinition. The architects of the modern withholding system, introduced notably during wartime when questioning such measures could be framed as unpatriotic, were sophisticated people, treasury economists, policy designers. They understood behavioral psychology before behavioral psychology had a name, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand, or perhaps instructions they understood perfectly. And here is where the darkness deepens in a way I find impossible to dismiss. The income tax is not an American invention. Britain introduced a formal income tax in 1799, temporary, designed for the Napoleonic Wars, then abolished, reintroduced in 1842, and made permanent. Germany constructed its income tax infrastructure in the 1870s and 1880s. France debated and eventually implemented its own in the early 20th century. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all within a roughly similar historical window. Different governments, different political systems, different languages, cultures, legal traditions, and yet the same mechanism spreading across the industrialized world within the same century, the same basic architecture. Individual income reported, calculated, surrendered, enforced criminally. What explains that uniformity? You might say modernization. Industrialization created wage labor at scale, which created a taxable income stream that simply hadn't existed when most people were subsistence farmers or craftsmen. That is a reasonable explanation. But it doesn't explain the timing. It doesn't explain why the mechanisms appear in such strikingly similar forms, with such similar enforcement structures, in nations that were often geopolitical rivals. It doesn't explain why the criminalization follows such a consistent pattern across hostile borders. First the tax, then the bureaucracy, then the penalty structure, then the normalization. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across borders otherwise entirely resistant to coordination. Not parallel evolution, not coincidence, not the natural drift of policy ideas through diplomatic channels. Something more deliberate. Something that appears in the documentary record without ever having been publicly debated as a coordinated global project, and yet somehow arrived at globally identical conclusions. I am not telling you what that means. I am asking you to sit with what it implies. Let me tell you what I believe we have forgotten. Not just the money, though the money is real, and the accumulated total surrendered by ordinary families across 5 generations is staggering beyond easy calculation. But the money is not the deepest loss. The deepest loss is a concept. The concept that what you produce belongs to you. That the labor of your hands, your mind, your time, irreplaceable, non-renewable human time, is yours by a claim that precedes any government's authority over it. That was the assumption built into the original constitutional architecture. Not explicitly stated, assumed. The way you do not write down that the sky is blue because every living person can see it. That assumption is gone now, replaced. The new assumption, so thoroughly normalized that speaking the old one aloud sounds dangerous and strange, is that your income belongs first to the state, which then graciously permits you to keep a portion. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pre-1913 world was not perfect freedom. It held slavery, robber barons, crushing poverty for millions. I am not romanticizing it. But embedded in its legal structure was a recognition, a protected recognition, that the individual's productive output carried a status the government could not simply claim. That recognition is now a historical artifact. We didn't lose it in a war. We didn't lose it in a revolution. We surrendered it in a tax bill, incrementally, quietly, with rates so low at first that no one felt it as the permanent transformation it was. I keep returning to that congressional record, that single line. Written in 1911, 2 years before everything changed. The man who wrote it, a congressman from a Midwestern state, now largely forgotten, was making a legal argument against the amendment. He lost. His argument was entered into the record, archived and left to yellow in a basement for a century until a digitization project dragged it back into the light. He understood what was being constructed. He saw the architecture for what it was. Did the men who built it understand it too? Did they know they were not merely crafting tax policy, but redesigning the foundational relationship between citizens and the institutions that govern them? Did they anticipate that within 30 years, automatic withholding would make the entire transaction invisible? Did they foresee the enforcement apparatus, the criminal penalties, the cultural normalization so total that questioning the income tax would eventually feel like questioning gravity itself? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But here is what I do know. Your ancestors, not ancient ancestors, Not medieval serfs, but your great-grandparents, people whose photographs exist, whose letters survive, whose voices were captured on early recording cylinders, lived in a world where keeping what you earned was not a radical proposition. It was just Tuesday. That world ended officially, legally, constitutionally in 1913, in 1 year, with one amendment, and then they made it a crime to live as your ancestors had lived. Not an accident, not an oversight, not a necessary evolution, a deliberate